Imagine a world where religion was never invented. No gods to fear, no commandments to follow, no holy books dictating morality. At first glance, it might seem like a utopia: freedom from dogma, liberation from rituals, liberation from centuries of wars fought in the name of unseen deities. But let's pause. What would truly happen if humans had never needed a higher power to explain the unexplainable? History, psychology, and sociology offer some unsettling clues. Without religion, humans would have faced the raw, unfiltered chaos of existence alone. No comforting illusions of afterlife or divine justice, no spiritual authority to blame for suffering. Every moral dilemma would fall on human reason and empathy. At first, you might think rationality alone could carry civilization. Yet, science tells us that human morality evolved in tandem with belief systems. Religion has been an early framework for cooperation and social cohesion. Without it, would societies even have survived long enough to develop complex civilizations? Anthropologists suggest our ancestors' brains craved stories, rituals, and shared beliefs to foster trust. Without that glue, early tribes might have fractured under the pressures of survival, leaving us scattered, isolated, and violent. But imagine, despite this, humanity somehow adapts. Early humans invent philosophy instead of scripture, logic instead of law handed down from a god. The turning point comes not in a flash of divine revelation but in the first conscious recognition that survival depends on shared ethics, empirical reasoning, and cooperation. Instead of church spires, there are councils; instead of religious festivals, there are seasonal gatherings celebrating life itself. War, though, never disappears entirely, because war is human, not divine, but it is fought for resources, territory, and ideology rather than holy mandates. Here's where it gets radical: without religion, would the world be more peaceful, or crueler? Psychologists argue that religion suppresses certain instincts but also magnifies tribalism. Remove it, and the restraint disappears, but so does the sanctified excuse to kill. Humanity faces moral chaos without the comforting "God wills it" narrative. In this world, the biggest institutions that dominate our lives today would look completely different. The army would be stripped of the idea of fighting for divine purpose; soldiers might struggle with existential questions before charging into battle. Police would rely entirely on civil law and human consensus, without moral absolutes preached from pulpits. Religion's control over billions of minds would vanish, but so would the sense of ultimate meaning for most. Some individuals would flourish in personal responsibility, embracing radical honesty and self-reliance. Others would crumble, lost in the abyss of moral uncertainty. Science might accelerate faster, no censorship from religious authorities, but the human psyche might fracture under the weight of too much freedom. And yet, perhaps the most shocking change would come in culture and art. No religious cathedrals, no sacred music, no epic poems inspired by divine figures. Artists would turn entirely to human struggles, nature, and raw emotion. Every painting, every story, every myth would be grounded in human experience, not God's. Some scholars argue that this could produce the purest form of creativity ever witnessed, but would it also produce existential dread on a scale the world has never known? Religion, in a twisted sense, acts as a buffer, a psychological safety net. Without it, humans might invent technology and art at unprecedented speed, but at a cost we cannot fully calculate. In terms of daily life, rituals would still exist, their neurological patterns we crave, but they would be entirely secular: holidays marking seasons, rites of passage marking age, ceremonies celebrating collective human achievement rather than divine will. Yet, without the absolute moral compass of religion, crimes motivated by ideology could skyrocket. No divine punishment, no ultimate judgment, just human law, imperfect and inconsistent. Would society evolve stricter enforcement, or would chaos reign in the streets? Some argue the lack of religious fear might lead to the most ethical society ever, built entirely on reason and empathy. Others predict nihilism on a global scale. Now imagine how this affects education. Children would learn science earlier, but also philosophy, ethics, and critical thinking. Adults would confront mortality directly, without comforting fables. The conversation about life, death, and meaning would shift from "God decides" to "we decide." And here's the twist: in a world free from religion, every human becomes responsible for morality, every choice weighed entirely on rational, ethical reasoning, with no supernatural excuses. The pressure is unimaginable, but it might also produce the most intellectually evolved species the planet has ever seen. If this radical vision fascinates or terrifies you, hit that subscribe button. In the next part, we'll explore how religion-free society would reshape politics, crime, and social hierarchies, and why the absence of gods might unleash both the most incredible progress and the darkest chaos humanity has ever known. Without religion, politics transforms in ways the world has never seen. No divine right of kings, no theocracies, no holy endorsements for rulers. Governments must rely entirely on tangible legitimacy, competence, persuasion, and, ironically, charisma. But here's the brutal truth: humans crave narratives. Even without gods, politicians invent ideologies that function almost like secular religions. Nationalism, radical political movements, cults of personality, all fill the vacuum left by faith. The risk? Ideological wars might replace holy wars, fueled not by scripture but by abstract concepts: freedom, equality, or power. History suggests that humans are capable of mass violence whether motivated by gods or ideas. Religion was a tool for both control and peacekeeping. Remove it, and humanity is left with raw, unfiltered tribal instincts, now projected onto ideology. Crime takes on a different hue. Without fear of divine judgment, morality becomes a matter of personal or societal contract. Some people would evolve into hyper-ethical beings, driven by reason and empathy alone. Others would exploit the lack of cosmic consequence to justify extreme selfishness. Would murder rates spike or drop? Data from secular societies suggest that morality can thrive without gods, but in a world where religious restraint never existed, early civilizations might have seen levels of crime so extreme that social collapse would be inevitable. Law enforcement would have to innovate faster than ever, relying not on moral authority but on social contracts, surveillance, and logic. Police might emerge as the ultimate human arbitrators, responsible not only for law but for shaping ethical behavior in a population with no divine compass. Let's turn to war. Armies stripped of divine sanction would face a crisis of purpose. In our world, soldiers are comforted by the notion that they fight for God or righteousness. Without that, motivation relies entirely on patriotism, survival, and personal honor. History shows that humans struggle with existential uncertainty. Imagine going to war knowing there's no divine witness, no higher justice, just the cold consequences of action. Would this make armies more disciplined, more brutal, or more reluctant? Probabilities suggest a mix. Advanced strategy would emerge, driven by logic, but the psychological toll might increase exponentially. Veterans could suffer existential trauma at unprecedented levels, unbuffered by faith. Religious chaplains would be replaced by therapists, philosophers, and ethicists. The battlefield becomes not a holy crusade but a testing ground for human morality and resilience. In education and culture, the effects are staggering. Without religious censorship, knowledge expands rapidly. No Galileo condemned, no books burned, no ideological limits on curiosity. Humans pursue physics, biology, psychology, and philosophy with unrestrained zeal. The rate of technological progress accelerates. Medicine and space exploration advance decades ahead of our current timeline. Yet, creativity takes a dark turn. Without divine inspiration, myths and legends are replaced by human-centered epics. Art celebrates life and suffering without consolation, producing masterpieces that dazzle but haunt. Literature becomes raw, unflinching, and brutally honest. Music and theater strip away moral lessons dictated by religion, focusing purely on emotion, logic, and the human condition. Religion's absence also reshapes social hierarchies. No clergy, no caste system sanctioned by God. Wealth, intelligence, and influence dominate. Meritocracy reigns, but so does ruthless competition. Without spiritual egalitarianism, inequality might rise unchecked. Philosophers predict a paradox: rationality can promote fairness, but ambition drives inequality. Communities would have to consciously design ethics into society, or risk creating oligarchies ruled by the smartest and strongest, unchecked by moral authority. Social rituals would still exist, but entirely secular: communal festivals, academic achievements, rites of passage, all designed to replace spiritual meaning with shared human purpose. Even in intimate life, relationships transform. Marriage and family are based solely on mutual agreement, attraction, and societal norms. Without divine rules, morality is fluid, evolving with culture. Sexuality, gender, and partnership could be celebrated with unprecedented freedom, or exploited to extremes. Humans must confront mortality directly, nurture meaning in every action, and grapple with existential terror daily. Some would thrive, crafting lives of radical fulfillment; others would spiral into nihilism, paralyzed by the lack of cosmic oversight. The psychological divide could be wider than anything history has ever recorded. Now imagine the human mind stripped of religious scaffolding, forced to confront the ultimate truths without comfort: mortality, suffering, and the vast, indifferent universe. Religion has long acted as a psychological safety net, cushioning humans from the terror of meaninglessness. Without it, every individual must create their own purpose, or risk existential collapse. Psychology suggests this would produce two extreme groups: one capable of extraordinary self-realization, and another overwhelmed by nihilism. The first could achieve intellectual and creative feats beyond imagination, building art, philosophy, and science at a pace never before seen. The second could spiral into despair, violence, or cult-like idolization of secular leaders, replacing gods with celebrities or ideologies. Consider morality. Without divine rules, humans must base ethics entirely on reason, empathy, and consequence. The upside: ethical systems become adaptive, practical, and scientifically informed. Harm, consent, and fairness dictate action rather than dogma. The downside: morality becomes relative, debated endlessly, and enforced inconsistently. Psychologists predict the rise of moral anxiety, constant questioning of right and wrong, multiplied across millions of individuals. Society would need robust philosophical education just to maintain cohesion. Those unwilling or unable to adapt could fall prey to nihilism or authoritarian secular ideologies. Religion also influences how humans process suffering. In our world, pain is often framed as divine punishment or a test of faith. Without that narrative, suffering is stark, raw, and unmediated. Medical science would advance faster: no religious prohibitions on anatomy, experimentation, or treatment, but the human psyche would face a severe burden. Mental health crises could skyrocket unless philosophical and psychological systems evolve rapidly to replace the coping mechanisms that faith provides. Therapy, mindfulness, and secular spirituality would attempt to fill the void, but these interventions rely on human innovation rather than divine reassurance. What about extreme human behavior? History shows that religion can both inspire and restrain violence. Without it, the restraints imposed by fear of divine judgment vanish. Individuals and groups driven purely by ambition, ideology, or instinct could act with shocking brutality. Yet, paradoxically, the lack of sacred justification for atrocities might also prevent wars fought explicitly for God's will. It's a double-edged sword: less holy bloodshed, but more unrestrained, coldly rational cruelty. The moral calculus becomes entirely human, and humans are unpredictable. In the military, this change is profound. Soldiers face battle without sacred duty, religious chaplains vanish, and purpose must come from national loyalty or personal honor alone. Combat stress could intensify, but strategies might become more efficient, more calculated. The glorification of martyrdom disappears: soldiers fight for survival, ideology, or victory, not divine reward. Police and law enforcement would face similar pressures. Maintaining order in a world without moral absolutes becomes a constant balancing act. Authority relies on reason and enforcement, not fear of sin or damnation. Science and innovation flourish. Religious dogmas often delayed progress. Imagine modern medicine, AI, or space exploration accelerated by centuries. Human ingenuity, unshackled from spiritual constraints, could achieve technological utopias, or dystopias. Nuclear energy, AI, genetic engineering, without ethical caution rooted in religious morality, humans might push boundaries faster than wisdom can manage. The result, breathtaking potential, shadowed by existential risk. Even culture, art, and storytelling shift dramatically. Epic myths about gods are replaced by human-centered narratives. Music celebrates raw emotion, drama explores ethical dilemmas without divine answers, and literature confronts death and meaning without consolation. Some works achieve transcendent brilliance, others plunge into despair and cynicism. Religion's psychological safety net vanishes, leaving the human mind to navigate extremes of hope and despair alone. Imagine the world at large, a civilization built entirely without religion. Borders, alliances, and conflicts arise not from divine mandates but purely human calculations. Diplomacy is grounded in pragmatism, trade, and ideology. Without holy wars, some argue humanity could achieve peace faster, but history warns us otherwise. Humans do not require gods to justify violence. Ideology, resources, and power are enough. Nations could become hyper-rational machines, negotiating, spying, and manipulating with cold precision. Yet, the absence of moral absolutism might also lead to instability. Without shared faith-based norms, agreements are fragile, trust is harder to establish, and betrayal is more likely. The global stage becomes a high-stakes chessboard where morality is debated, quantified, and often ignored. Religion's absence transforms social structures profoundly. Charities, hospitals, and educational institutions historically tied to religious organizations would need to be reinvented as secular systems. Some communities might flourish, driven by pure empathy and logic. Others could collapse under neglect, especially where human altruism fails without spiritual incentive. Philanthropy would rely on reasoned ethics rather than moral obligation, and governments would be forced to fill gaps previously managed by religious institutions. Societies capable of coordinating large-scale secular systems could achieve unimaginable efficiency, but the failure to do so could lead to unprecedented suffering. The economy evolves radically. Without religious holidays, tithes, or restrictions, labor patterns and consumption shift. Secular ethics could foster fairer trade practices, but without spiritual accountability, corruption and exploitation might rise unless stringent rational oversight emerges. Markets would reward efficiency and intelligence over piety, creating an environment where meritocracy reigns, but at the risk of deepening inequalities. Cultural trends would accelerate, driven not by ritual but by collective human desire, fashion, and innovation. Art, music, and media explode in diversity, but the comforting narratives that once provided shared meaning vanish. Religion's grip on education, once a powerful tool for shaping thought, disappears entirely. Children are taught critical thinking, ethics, science, and philosophy from the outset. The result, intellectual advancement surges, but moral education becomes more complex. Without divine guidelines, ethical reasoning must be deliberately taught and rigorously enforced. Students may emerge highly rational yet struggle with existential questions that religion once simplified. The population divides between those capable of navigating moral ambiguity and those overwhelmed by it, producing stark contrasts in behavior and worldview. Even the military transforms dramatically. Without faith, soldiers fight for survival, loyalty, or ideology alone. Chaplains vanish, prayers are replaced by strategic planning, and the concept of martyrdom fades. Armies become technically superior, disciplined, and perhaps colder, but the absence of religious justification for heroism or sacrifice could erode morale in extreme situations. Similarly, police forces and judicial systems must operate purely on logic, law, and societal consensus, with no moral absolutes to guide judgment. Civil obedience depends entirely on reason and consequence, not fear of divine punishment. On the individual level, humans face unprecedented psychological pressure. Confronted with the raw reality of death and suffering, each person must construct meaning from scratch. Some rise to astonishing heights of creativity, empathy, and understanding, producing works of art, philosophy, and science unmatched in history. Others descend into nihilism, cynicism, or destructive behavior, unchecked by the spiritual deterrents that once constrained them. This split could be extreme, creating a society simultaneously brilliant and perilous. In culture and entertainment, mythology and religion vanish, replaced by human-centric narratives. Music explores raw emotion without sacred framing, literature confronts mortality with brutal honesty, and theater dramatizes moral ambiguity instead of divine justice. Some artists achieve unparalleled depth, but others plunge audiences into despair, exposing the human psyche's vulnerability without a divine buffer. Religion-free civilization pushes creativity and logic to extremes, producing brilliance, but also existential risk. If this vision of a religion-free world challenges everything you believe, hit that subscribe button. In the final part, we'll confront the ultimate question: would humanity thrive or implode? How would daily life, love, morality, and global society evolve, and could we survive the psychological weight of a universe without gods? Now we reach the ultimate question: in a world without religion, would humanity thrive, or collapse under the weight of its own freedom? The consequences touch every corner of life, every human decision, every interaction. Without the comfort of divine oversight, mortality is stark, suffering is raw, and morality is an entirely human construction. Some would rise to the challenge, crafting ethical systems based on empathy, reason, and consequence, achieving heights of creativity and intelligence that our current civilization can only imagine. Others, overwhelmed by the absence of eternal guidance, could fall into despair, nihilism, or authoritarian dependence on secular leaders. The divide between enlightened and lost might be wider than anything humanity has ever experienced. Daily life transforms profoundly. Marriage, family, and social bonds are negotiated purely on mutual respect, desire, and practicality. Parenting focuses on education, ethics, and emotional intelligence rather than religious instruction. Communities unite around shared values, humanist ideals, or collective goals instead of sacred laws. Holidays, celebrations, and rituals still exist, but they are secular, creative, and entirely flexible, reflecting human ingenuity rather than divine command. Yet, with no ultimate moral compass, every social contract is fragile, every ethical decision subject to debate, and the pressure to choose correctly immense. Science and innovation surge ahead at unprecedented speed. No religious censorship, no fear of blasphemy, humans push boundaries in medicine, space exploration, and genetic engineering. Technology could reach utopian potential decades or centuries faster than in our timeline. But with such power comes risk, unchecked experimentation, ethical ambiguity, and the absence of sacred moral limits could produce disasters on a global scale. Nuclear energy, artificial intelligence, and bioengineering become tools of both immense progress and existential threat, relying entirely on human wisdom rather than divine restraint. Culture and art experience a renaissance, and a reckoning. Literature, music, and visual art dive deep into raw human experience, unflinching and unmediated by religious morality. Without gods to blame, artists confront life, death, suffering, and joy head-on. Masterpieces of thought and emotion emerge, but so does an undercurrent of existential despair. Humans are forced to ask, over and over, why live, why suffer, why love, why die? For some, this produces brilliance, for others, paralyzing nihilism. In governance and society, the implications are staggering. Politicians, military leaders, and law enforcement must operate purely on logic, strategy, and social contracts. Ideologies replace dogmas, rationality replaces divine justification, and meritocracy becomes absolute, but with it, inequality and competition intensify. Trust is harder to establish without shared faith, yet cooperation becomes a deliberate, reasoned choice rather than an imposed obligation. Civilization thrives on intellect, empathy, and communication, but the absence of religion magnifies every flaw in human reasoning, every weakness in morality. The psychological burden on humanity is colossal. Religion once shielded minds from the abyss of meaninglessness, now, each individual faces it directly. Some achieve radical enlightenment, understanding their existence as a unique and precious opportunity for creation, love, and discovery. Others succumb to despair, ideology, or destructive behavior. Humanity becomes a species defined not by gods, but by its courage to face reality unflinchingly, a species capable of unimaginable achievement or catastrophic self-destruction. And here's the radical conclusion: a world without religion would be both magnificent and terrifying. Unfettered creativity, accelerated science, pure reason, and unprecedented freedom, but also moral chaos, existential dread, and social instability. Humanity would be forced to invent purpose, morality, and meaning from scratch, a test of intellect, empathy, and courage unlike anything ever faced. The stakes could not be higher: thrive and redefine civilization, or collapse under the unbearable weight of freedom. Now it's your turn. Imagine this world. Could we survive it, or would we implode? Comment below with your thoughts, and suggest the next mind-bending question we should explore. What reality should we dissect next, where the human mind and society face radical possibilities beyond imagination?